Okay, welcome back. So we're still going through Unit 5. So far today, in the morning, I did the lecture on the Renaissance. That was the art historical topic that introduces Unit 5. And then the art medium was painting. Although, as I pointed out during that lecture, it's only half of painting. We'll get to the second half of painting in Unit 6. Painting is the only art medium where I actually split it up into two parts. Um, Color also is split up into two parts. We have part one, the basics here, and then I think it's not until either Unit 7 or Unit 8 that we get to, I think it's Unit 8 that we get to the color, the more advanced stuff. So anyway, but we're going to be talking about color basics at the moment. And so we're going to, like every lecture, and so color is one of the design concepts for this lecture besides color. And obviously we're talking about color because the art medium that we're talking about is painting. And so in painting, the issues of color are the most paramount of all the art mediums. And so that's one of the reasons why we're talking about painting. We're talking about color. The other design issue that we're going to be talking about this unit is balance, and I'm going to do that as a separate lecture. Um, okay, and so you can see kind of the main parts here that we're going to be covering, and some of the most important things that you're going to need to know is you're going to need to know the definitions of things like what is primary and secondary color, the definitions of what is an analogous color or color relationship, what is a complementary or split complementary organization or a split complement. When we say one color is another complement of another color, what do we mean by that? You're going to need to know the differences in meaning between hue, value, and intensity, and up to a degree. I mean, that's a very intense topic that takes a couple of units of studio work for students in a design class to really start to grapple with. But we're going to just do it more on a surface level. And then we're going to end talking about other kinds of color organizations in paintings primarily, but in other kinds of color two-dimensional artwork as well. Okay, to start with the color wheel, and we're probably all somewhat familiar with the basics of the color wheel, which is that the color wheel goes around in hue, right? Where we're going from yellow through the greens, blues into the violets, magenta into the reds, right? And then into oranges back to yellow. This particular color wheel is all based off of animated characters. And then we have neutrals in the middle, both all white as well as some that are mostly black and some that are gray. Um, so there you go. That's one way of thinking about the color wheel. And here are a couple of others. This is the Munsell color wheel chart, which gives you, it's slightly different than what you would expect. Munsell considers green as like there are as one of the primaries. And so then whereas it says like we got yellow, green, right? And then we have the in-betweens between yellow and green. And then we have blue, then we have purple, and then instead of violet, strangely enough. And then we have reds, but we don't have an orange, right? Orange is just simply represented um, by how much we have of red and how much we have of yellow. So um, so a 10R versus a 10YR, right? So a true orange is actually just 5YR, which is like half and half yellow and red in the Munsell system. But each system is different. Okay, on this page, some of the main points I want to make is I want to just emphasize that color perception in the human eye is based off of some basic facts about color is light, right? Like no object has a color. Okay. Every object only has the color that it can reflect. And what that means is that depending on what light is shining on any particular object, that's going to change what colors we can or should see off of that object. Doesn't mean that local color is completely non-existent, right? But it just means that the color that we see when we're looking at a particular object is both a reflection of what the color of the object is, but also a reflection of what the various colors of light that are shining on it or being reflected on it are. Okay, so that's point number one. Point number two, and you can see the idea of color is light, right? We've got the classic prism spectrum, right? Or you can see in this chart that color shifts along all these different, like all these changes of electromagnetic wavelength radiation, right? Give us different colors. That's light, right? All those different colors. But our eyes are not designed to see all of those colors. In fact, our eyes are only designed to see three of them, right? Our eyes are tuned to see a very kind of blue-violet blue, right? That particular, or really, that's still a little bit light. It should be darker than that, somewhere in where what we have right there. A deep, dark blue-violet, right, is one of the things our eyes have sensors for seeing. And then you see these two other bands over here. They're very close to each other. One is for seeing reds, but it's not any red. That red's actually a little bit off. It should be more on the red-orange side to fully represent an RGB red. And then an RGB green, which is more on the yellow side. So, right? So what that means is that when you're looking at this screen right now and you see that color yellow, there is no actual yellow light shining in your eyes, right? You see that yellow because there are little tiny dots on your screen of red, like RGB red and RGB green. And because they're balanced exactly half and half and shining at your eyes, your eye interprets that as yellow. But there is no actual yellow. This doesn't mean that yellow doesn't exist. It just means that when you're looking at color on any kind of screen, because almost all the screens that we look at are RGB screens, meaning that they use RGB red, RGB green, and RGB blue violet. And oh, someone is in here. Who is here?
It's me.
Hey, Jasmine.
Hi.
Hey.
And I'm Frazier, by the way. I think you got more than one Jasmine.
Right, yeah, I have two Jasmines, a Jasmine Pugh and Jasmine Frazier. Thank you for letting me know. Make sure when you sign into the chat that you make sure that that's clear. And so I'm doing the lecture on color, and I'm explaining the basics of color as light and the basics of color as biology, right? That we only have three types of cone cells that receive light. And what that means is that when we're looking at any other color other than RGB green or RGB red, it's really kind of a fiction that our brain is creating. It's taking like, because each of these, like, let's say our green sensors, right, are set to be most kind of like excited, most buzzed when actual RGB green light is shining at it. But if other kind of slightly, slightly more yellowish green or slightly more bluish greens shine at it, it will also be somewhat kind of like excited, right? And similarly, our red is only set to be, like it's most kind of like most stimulated when it's getting the specific RGB red, which is red kind of on the red orange side. But if it gets other kinds of colors, yellows, right, and reds, or even yellow greens, it will also be kind of, it will be kind of like stimulated. So that's how we see yellow. See, like that point right there. We're not actually, when we see yellow, we don't have any sensors to specifically see yellow. It's instead that our RGB green sensors are going, huh, there's something kind of almost like green. And our RGB red sensors are going, huh, there's something almost like red here. And our brain takes that signal of our reds thinking, maybe almost red, and our greens thinking, almost maybe green, and combining that to go, oh, this is yellow, or this is yellow orange, right? And so that's also true of of cyan, right? Blues that are more on the true kind of like blue-green side. We only see them basically through our brain guessing at them, right? We know that when our eyes are picking up that kind of like field right there, and each of those, you know, both actually all of them would be kind of buzzed a little bit, just a little bit stimulated. Our eyes know, oh, that must be cyan. Interestingly enough, so yellow exists, right? And cyan light exists. All kinds of green lights exist, including RGB green, but also cooler greens and more yellowish greens. All kinds of blues exist, right? And even there are some violet lights are even a little bit more deeply violet than the RGB blue violet. Okay. So, and there are all kinds of reds that exist. But the one color on here that doesn't actually exist is magenta. There is no magenta light. Like if you go out of the human spectrum, right, out into the infrared over here, there is no light that matches. Like there's no light that you could find that you could shine at our eyes that we would go, ah, that's magenta. And similarly, over on this side, in the ultraviolet side, there is no light that you could shine in our eyes and we would go, oh, there's a magenta. But if you shine light that it has both frequencies that really tap into um, our blue violet and really tap into our red, right? If you shine light to kind of like stimulate both of those simultaneously, our brain is going to kind of fill in the gap, and it makes this new fictitious color that is magenta, right? And it seems real to us, we believe it, but there is no such thing as magenta light. So it's in a way, it's a fictional color. So anything else you wanted me to cover about that? What point did you come in the lecture?
Um, you was talking about the different lights and how it, came off and stuff.
Okay. So
I missed the front part,
yeah,
basically.
on
I
the
came
on the
in the
starting
middle.
yeah, and the starting point here, I talked about color wheels just a little bit. I probably
Mm-hmm.
spent a little bit too long explaining the difference of the Munsell color wheel compared to other color wheels that you're more familiar with.
Mm-hmm.
Um, One of the main, and we started with this color wheel. One of the main points I would make about color wheels is that all these color wheels, they're all models, right? Like when we get to the second lecture on color, I'll show you the chromaticity chart, and which is quite different from these. And you'll see how every model of color is just an approximation, and some are more flawed than others. Like we tend to think, oh, well, this is the color wheel. It's completely and 100% right. And in fact, it's not completely 100% right. Like one of the main things that's wrong with this kind of standard color wheel is that it gives us the same amount of room for green as it does for orange, right? That we go yellow, orange to red, orange. And like, so it believes basically that the distance from yellow to red is the same amount, the same number of visible colors as the distance between yellow to blue. And that's just not the case. Like the Munsell color chart actually expands that a little bit. There's more room for greens than there are for oranges. But in fact, and so Munsell was kind of ahead of his time, but the actual chromaticity chart shows you that the difference is enormous. Like there's like in some ways there's more room for the greens than there are for like, the yellows to reds to magentas, all the way on the other side of the chart. There's just our eye is so much more attuned to being able to see small differences of greens in all kinds of ways. And this makes sense when you think about it in terms of the way our eyes work, and when you think about how evolution works, that like the world is mostly made out of greenery, right? It's mostly made out of plants and stuff. And being able to perceive subtle changes in green is really an important adaptation. So we can actually see a lot more color in green than we can see in just about anything else, which is why like these kind of color wheels are they're fine. They're not completely incorrect, but they're an approximation that's not exactly 100% true. So color is light, and but color is also biology, that our eyes have cells specifically designed for observing those colors. Now we have both rod cells and cone cells, and the main purpose of the rod cells is just to see value, right? Like we use our rod cells all the time, but the times when we really rely on our rod cells is at night, right? When we have very little light information and we pretty much can't use our cone cells for much color identification. And so we are much more heavily dependent on our rod cells for seeing, like in dark light situations, which is also very useful. And one of the end results of that is that although color is really important, value, light and dark, how colors relate to light and dark is even more important. And we'll talk about that a little bit more. Well, actually, we'll talk about it right now. So there are three main characteristics of all colors, right? There is hue, there's intensity, and there's value. And we can call intensity saturation, or we could call it, is there another one that I'm thinking, or chroma is another word that people sometimes use. But I prefer intensity. And intensity could be defined as like how pure a particular color is, right? Like if you had a red color and then you're like, is it a super saturated red? Is it only just that red and no other color? Or is it mixed with neutrals, and how mixed with neutrals? And so this chart's trying to demonstrate the idea that you could have changes of intensity without any change of value. They didn't do it as well as they could have, because if you might notice, it kind of gets darker right here in the middle. Like that's a little bit darker. That's about the same. That's probably the darkest one. And then we're starting to get lighter as we go up. And then these all get lighter as they go down, right? So it's like darkest in the middle, right around here. And to do that chart perfectly, there would be no value change whatsoever. But this is a chart that I found. I will show you one that a student made that's actually a little bit better than that. Now notice also that the hues, right, are organized where we're showing as intense a version of the hues as possible. And in general, they go from light valued hues, right? Like yellow is most intense at a light value, right? To darkest, right? Like blue violet is most intense at a darker value. And then they get lighter again, with one exception that we have this kind of blue-green kind of standing out, which is a bit of a shame, but I'm not going to redesign someone else's work. So here are some examples of talking about changes of hue, but especially changes of intensity with as little value change as possible. These were done by students, and this green chart is really close to perfect, right? Like that gray is very close to the exact same value as that green, but not only that, every change along here mostly stays really close to the same value. There's a little bit more change in value on the red chart, but it's still, like, notice how this one stands out as being a little bit extra dark. But they're still doing a better job than the professionals did on the previous page. So kudos to my students. Here's another one that's also quite good. It gets it's a little bit, just a little bit darker on the right-hand side, but on the whole, it's doing a really good job. Okay, and so once again, the main thing that you need to know is just, you don't have to, like, if you were one of my students in a design class, you'd have to be able to make a chart like this, right? Both painted, but also like in like Photoshop, to make a chart where you could demonstrate, I can see these being exactly the same value or as close as possible. And that takes a lot of practice, a lot of training. For you guys in this class, all you really need to be able to do is just know the definition, know what hue really is, know what intensity is, and know what value really is, and know how they relate to each other, right? Like that, a lot of students struggle at first because they just don't understand how something can change in intensity without changing in value, which is why I spent as much time as I did kind of showing these, right? The things can change in intensity without any change or almost no change in value. Okay, so next we're going to talk about the primary colors and the secondary colors, but we're also going to be talking about color organization. So there's various ways that colors can be organized in paintings, right? And so one of them is what we call triads. And probably the most famous triads would be the primary triads. But there are actually two different primary sets here, right? We have in the Mondrian painting, it is the primary colors that we call the traditional primaries, right? Which is red, and blue and yellow, right? And that's usually also called the subtractive system of color. Subtractive meaning because it's based off of the way light reflects off of surfaces, that's subtracting color, right? It's like color bounces off a thing, and then whatever is reflected back is a subtraction of the color. Whereas in the Ellsworth Kelly painting, he's using the additive color system and using the primaries of the additive color system, and those are the RGB red. And notice his RGB red is closer to the exact RGB red, RGB green, which is really, really close, and then RGB blue, which is almost is a little bit off. It's just not quite as much on the violet side as it should be, but pretty darn close. Okay, so he's using also the primary triad, but just a different primary triad, right? There's the additive primary triad versus the subtractive or the projected light primary triad, right? The kind that we use on our screens, like what we're watching right now, versus the traditional, which is the kind we use when we're making paint and we're mixing colors. Okay. So there also could be like triadic organizations using secondary colors, and that could be like if we were thinking about the traditional system, that would be green, um, green, violet, and orange, right? Whereas if we were thinking about the projected light system, the additive color system, that would be magenta, cyan, and and yellow. Okay, and and remember, I'll probably put it as an extra credit question somewhere. Remember, if you that A, that magenta is a fictional color, and C, if you can remember how to explain that. Okay. All right. So besides triadic types of organizations, we also have what are called analogous color organizations. That's where an artist uses mostly, and these are like more general rules. I pick examples that are very, very close to pure, right? But like this is almost entirely blue greens to yellow greens to some yellow, right? So it's very much an analogous color organization, and this is exactly just red, orange, and yellow type analogous color organization. But there are lots of paintings where it's 80% analogous color with a little bit of some other color kind of thing. But anyway, they are both examples of analogous. And the way you define analogous, let's go back to the color wheel for a second. The way you define analogous is it's an organization where you're using a grouping of colors all on one section of the color wheel, right? A lot of people, when they're doing analogous color organizations, they like the red to yellow color organization. And one of the reasons is because it feels very unified, right? All these colors are very warm and they're very similar in many ways, right? So it feels very unified, but it also provides a lot of clear contrast because they change a lot in value, right? And that's partially because yellow is the lightest of colors, right? It's the most intense at the lightest value. Um, Whereas if you did like magenta to like blue or blue green, you would what I'm trying to say, you wouldn't have as much value change going on. Okay. So analogous color organizations. Complementary color organizations are where you have pairs of colors that are on the opposite side of the color wheel. Um, and so that could be, we can sometimes talk about like, like let's say a green to red type, but it doesn't have to be the exact green. It could be more like a slightly more yellowish green to that red or something like that. But it's like pairs of colors that are on the opposite side of the color wheel. Sometimes we also have things that we call split complementaries, where it might be like, this red and this red orange, or this red and this orange paired with that green and that blue green, or that blue actually. Blue to the orange, red to the green would be a good, right, example. So in in the Joan Mitchell painting, it's very much kind of like it's dominated by the dialogue between a couple of blues, but primarily this color blue versus the oranges and kind of brownish oranges. But there is also a little bit of pairing of this kind of magenta red with some of these greens, right? So it's like this double set pairing of complements to each other. And it's a painting that's all about complementary colors. Even though there's lots of other color, right? There's lots of neutral color, lots of, ambiguous, hard to read color, but overall, the kind of the color story of the painting is this kind of dialogue and even to a degree almost like this battle between complementary colors. Or similarly, if we look at the Arnolfini wedding, right? It is, although the painting has a lot of other colors in it, right? It has a lot of kind of like neutralish, brownish kind of colors that are sort of gray to brown to black and somewhere in between those areas, right? And that's the predominant color. But the colors that stand out to us the most as being the most important colors in the painting are the reds of the bed and the back kind of chair bench thing, and then the green of the dress, right? And so the dialogue of the green in the dress to the red is one of the main things that the painting is about. And we can talk about what that, how that reads in the painting. When I do the review session for the next test, which will be the midterm, I'll talk about how that relates to the meaning of the painting. Okay. And also you can have monochromatic color organizations where someone organizes a painting to be almost entirely just a hue with just a little bit of variation of intensity and a little bit of variation of temperature with that hue. And there's a bit of an exception here with like this one color spot there, which is much warmer than just about everything else. But in both of these paintings, and there's a few exceptions here of like some reds that pop out just a little bit as extra darks. But overall, so much of this color is kind of like going between this kind of like fleshy, kind of creamy, yellowy kind of white color to all these different kinds of yellows to all these different kinds of yellow oranges and orangish sort of colors. Has a very, both these have a very monochromatic feel. And monochromatic could also include paintings that are very low intensity or neutral. Sometimes painters will call these dead palettes, right? Where you're using just earth colors. Whoops, go back. Just using earth colors. So in this particular painting, there's a few exceptions, but like so much of this painting is done just basically raw umber, burnt umber, a little bit of burnt sienna, and then a lot of black and white, right? That's like 90% of the color there. But there's also just a few hints of with the white, like there may be, there's probably a little bit of alizarin crimson, which is a much cooler red in some places to help provide some of that cool color. Maybe even a little bit of something like there might have been some kind of blue mixed in some places on the skin tone, and there might have been something like a cooler kind of beside, even cooler than raw umber, something like maybe like a turkey umber, like a greenish kind of umber. Okay, so we're gonna just once again review hue, intensity, and value, because next we're gonna look at the paintings. Jasmine, do you have someone watching with you?
Yep, a 1-year-old, unfortunately.
Well, hopefully
Sorry.
it's okay. I don't have a problem with that. You can hear my dog whining in the background, so that's we both have some distractions. Hopefully she's enjoying some of the lecture. So we're gonna, did everything make sense so far?
Yes, sir.
Okay, so the main things, once again, that you'll need to remember for tests would be knowing the definition of hue, intensity, and value, knowing the definition of a monochromatic color organization, complementary color organization, analogous color, and analogous color organization, knowing what we mean when we say triadic color organization and the primary triads versus the secondary triads, understanding that there's a difference between the primary triad of the subtractive system, which is also the traditional, the painted system, versus the primary triad of the projected light, otherwise known as the additive color system. And that's pretty much it. Knowing that color is light and that we perceive color using the rod and cone cells of our eyes, and there's a particular bias because of that. And so lastly, we're just going to talk about a couple of paintings in terms of color, and then we'll also talk a little bit about reflective color and kind of hint at what we're going to be talking about the next time I talk about color. But do you have any questions for me before we wrap it up?
No.
Okay, so if we think about hue, intensity, and value, it can help us to kind of understand what's going on in a particular painting, right? That like every time a painter makes a painting and they're organizing a certain set of colors, they have to make decisions about how they're going to balance unity, trying to make all the colors go together, versus contrast, trying to make sure that everything is clear as to what this is versus what that is, right? And so here in Michelangelo's painting, one of his solutions is that the unity is primarily provided by there's the large amount of the painting is done in what's called a grisaille, which is basically like this grayish green color, right? And it's very neutral, and it's all the background space, right? And that's how the whole painting is painted at first, but then he comes back in and provides a little bit more saturation of color to certain objects. And so that allows him to kind of use those color decisions to kind of draw our attention to certain places, because he's starting by thinking in terms of value, starting by thinking about just organizing everything in terms of just those kind of neutralish colors in value, and then finishing by coming back and going, okay, we're going to make this part of the robe an extra deep kind of yellow orangish sort of color to really draw our attention to it. Whereas in Raphael's painting, there's a different kind of organization, right? That he's there's still an issue of unity, but the colors are a little bit more disparate from each other, because you can get much more intense colors in an oil painting. The jump from the deepness of this blue cloth to like the saturation of that red to the saturation of the countryside, the grass and everything, is quite jarring, really. It's hard to pull together, but he does pull together, partially because of the way he composes it, right? But also because he has some other decisions, like the way he makes all the main things that draw our attention are all much more neutral, right? Like interestingly enough, like the colors really pop, but like that's not where we're looking at the face or looking at the infant John the Baptist or the infant Jesus, right? Um, and they're all much more neutral and also much more on a kind of yellow to brownish kind of hue, right? Um, which is kind of probably what was the original ground color of the whole painting. He probably started in a similar way to Michelangelo did here. And then the other thing he's doing is he's keeping the colors very, very cool, shifting all the way to like these really kind of pale blues for the deep effect of the space. And here we have two examples of painters who are thinking about those same things, but they're also thinking about how color actually works in real life, right? Like if you think about it, both of these paintings are very local color, right? Like that they're basically just naming the colors of the objects in certain places, saying this cloth is this color, this cloth is that color. And sometimes the cloth may change a little bit in color as it goes into the shadows, but mostly it just gets darker. And Raphael is doing basically the same thing. But here, as we move into the Baroque and past the Baroque, right, from Peter Paul Rubens into Elizabeth Vigée Lebrun, we have painting that's much more about observing how color actually happens in a real space. And so one of the things that we have here is we have the difference between local color and ambient color. If you remember at the very, or not the very beginning, but like in this page right here, when I was talking about color being light, and I emphasized the idea that the color of an object is, is only partially true, right? Like I'm looking at something right now and it's blue, it's a particular blue, but the blue that I see on it is only that color that's very specific color because of what lights are shining on it. If you shine different lights on it, I'd see slightly different colors. So the color that we see of objects is as much dependent on the atmosphere and the light as is on any idea of the local color of the object. And so in these paintings, we're starting to see painters who are paying attention to that, noticing that. And I'll give you some examples. So like on the skin of Jesus here, right? This is an entombment painting. And so Jesus is dead, and we can see all these changes of color on his skin, like these shiftings from warm to cool, right? And those aren't so much reflections of change of local color. Peter Paul Rubens not saying that that his skin is, shifting wildly from yellow ochres to blues. What he's saying is that's the color of the light, and how where the skin is picking up the cool light in the shadows, it's going very kind of like almost bluish, and where it's picking up the warm light, it's going much more to the yellow ochre. Or another example is take a look at that along the side of that arm right there. And that is red, right? And it's a reflective color. The idea being is the color being reflected onto Jesus' skin from the deep red of that robe right next to him. Okay. Or to give you another example, if you look at this self-portrait by Vigée Lebrun and then look at the colors in the shadow cast by her hat, right? And you can see that we're picking up reflective colors from the hat. The shadow is not just a blank dark, right? It's not a lack of color. It's actually an addition of color. We're adding the reflection of the color of the hat into the shadow. And you can see all these changes of temperature and color going on, especially there in that top part of the portrait. And so my proof for this is like, what we would do in a design class is we would set up objects and then shine lights on them to help you kind of see how the color of the objects that you think you know are very dependent on what color light is being shined on it. Okay. And so like when you're looking at this yellow cube and the white, with a lot of light, like with white light shining on them, you see how much we can pick up the yellow from the cube on the side of the white. Much less so when everything is yellow, when there's yellow light shining everywhere. Or like you can see the same thing here with the different colors being reflected from the papers. All right, I think that's the end. It is. So do you have any questions for me?
No.
All right, so that's the lecture on color. And the next lecture is going to be at 7. But that's not, hopefully it's not going to be a lecture. That's going to be a answer and question session on writing the paper. So hopefully you can be there, and hopefully a lot of people will be there, because I want everyone to do well in this paper. And yeah, and I'll try to answer every question that people have about how to do the paper well. All right.
Okay.
Until then, I will see you.
All right. Thank you.
Okay, bye.